National Republican Senatorial Committee Chair Tim Scott is warning that the polling on President Trump's so-called Big Beautiful Bill is just breaking even. Those are his words. New reporting from Semafor says Scott is urging colleagues to promote pieces of the Republicans' new tax and spending law rather than the proposal writ large to help boost popularity with the public. The bill includes massive tax cuts as well as extra spending on defense and stricter immigration policies, but it attempts to offset the cost of both with cuts to social safety net programs like Medicaid and SNAP. Joining us now, congressional reporter for Semafor and the author of that piece, Eleanor Mueller. So we know that this bill had pieces that were popular and then not so popular. So what's the NRSC chair's warning here, and what's his biggest concern?
You know, it's a really interesting answer. The question was basically, are you concerned that this bill is not going over as well with voters as it could be? And his response was, you know, when you talk about it as a whole, it's not. And that, I think, gets into those cuts we were talking about that offset some of these things that are more positive, like no tax on tips. People do like the fact that, or at least some people like the fact that we're spending more on defense now than we used to be. And so what Scott is telling his colleagues to do in order to win in 2026 is to talk about the pieces of this bill instead of the overarching thing. In other words, to talk about the things that people like in the bill versus the things that had to go in order to pay for the bill, like Medicaid, like cuts to food assistance. And so that, I think, was a very telling comment as far as how the GOP thinks that this is going over with voters.
I think it's a very telling comment, but I also wonder if at least in 2026, it might not work, or it might just work, rather, because a lot of these healthcare cuts are deferred. Yes, there are lawmakers that are warning about rural hospitals shuttering. I've talked to friends who are providers in states across the country who say they are already starting to see ripple effects just on the theory of the cuts, not as these cuts actually hit, it'll get worse. But is there a part of it that focusing on the tax cuts piece might be fine for 2026 and Republicans can play defense later as the cuts actually take effect?
There's certainly a chance. But a lot of these Medicaid provisions are going to be rolled out between now and 2028. And so even though they take place mostly after the elections, there still will be effects now. And, you know, we saw reporting that a health care facility in Nebraska was closing right after the House passed its bill. You know, that was something that Don Bacon from Nebraska said he was maybe not going to vote for, and then he did end up voting for it. And on top of that, we have a bunch of Affordable Care Act subsidies that are expiring at the end of this year. And so people's premiums are already going to go up because of that. That was something Republicans could have addressed as part of this bill and chose not to. And so I think the combination of those, again, ACA subsidies and then the warning of this on the horizon might be enough to alert people to the fact that it's happening, especially as Democrats try and hit it so hard. You know, this is their entire strategy, really, is that people don't like their benefits being taken away from them. And so far, that seems to be reflected in the polling.
Yeah, and I think that Tim Scott knows what it has looked like in the past. 2018, I think, is the most recent example of Democrats being able to mobilize and energize their electorate with health care cut threats. And now it's borne out in the legislative package that we've even just seen. So I think that's going to be, we'll see how salient an issue, but it feels like it is really the entire ballgame. The other piece of this that I think is important for us to touch on is it felt like last week we just watched a true disintegration of bipartisanship in the House and in the Senate. And I wonder, when you look at the rescissions package, which is just clawing back that billions in funding, the way that it was done in partisan fashion, the way that you've got the OMB head now saying that future funding should be more partisan. You've got a government funding deadline in September. I mean, what is the mood right now on Capitol Hill as we barrel towards that? Because they've got 2 weeks of session, a long break in August, and then they come right back to it.
Yeah, I think they have 10 weeks total between now and a government shutdown. And I'd say that the mood, especially among Democrats, is a little bit despairing. You know, they are very aware at this point that there's not a ton that they can do as far as stopping Republicans from enacting either via the regular appropriations process, unless they can get the votes, or these rescissions packages, you know, some of these more party line policies that Trump has long sought. And I think OMB Director Russ Vought's comments were fascinating. You know, he was like, no one elects officials to go to D.C. and compromise with the other party. They elect them to come and push through their priorities. And so I certainly think that, Democrats are having to grapple right now with whether or not they really want to threaten a shutdown, which is something that we obviously did not see go well with the continuing resolution that they passed the last time we had this conversation, or if, you know, they maybe want to try and play ball despite the fact that they disagree with so much of this stuff.
Yeah, I do think that the dynamics are so much different now versus what they were in the spring, the last time Schumer averted a shutdown and helped Republicans, gave them the Democratic votes that they needed effectively. The concern then was you don't have a way of getting out of a shutdown. I think the concern now is still that. So we'll see ultimately what happens. There was one spot of legislating, though, coming out of the House last week. They did Crypto Week. They had a few issues, but ultimately they were able to pass this massive crypto legislation package. It's landmark in that it's the first time we're watching Congress sort of regulate these currencies. What was notable to you out of the way that this package moved through the House and the Senate?
So many things. So I covered financial services for years, and so crypto will always be one of my pet issues. And I think what was fascinating is we saw the Freedom Caucus the same way they did with the spending bill, with the rescissions package, hold out. You know, they stopped the bill from advancing the first time around because they said they had issues with the fact that not all of the bills were combined. They said they weren't confident that the Senate would wind up passing all of the proposals that they wanted as far as digital assets go. And we saw them do the same thing that they did on the spending package and the reconciliation bill, which was full of the mind of supporting it anyway. And it was striking to me, you know, how quick leaders both in the House and the Senate seemed to kind of walk back what they'd said they'd promised Freedom Caucus members. You know, they'd said, we'll put this ban on central bank digital currencies, which is when a government issues a cryptocurrency into must-pass defense legislation. And I sat down with House Majority Whip Tom Emmer the morning of the vote, and he said, you know, there's no 100% guarantees when it comes to legislating. It's whenever it gets over to the Senate, it's up to them what they're going to include versus not include. And then we saw Senate Banking Chair Tim Scott say the same thing on Friday. And so what they have to show for it, I'm not sure what, but that seems to be the story of legislating this Congress.
Yeah, it seems like everyone gets on board and passes everything, even if they're not happy with the thing that they are passing. A lot of action this week for Tim Scott, both at banking and in his campaign capacity for keeping Republican control of the Senate. Eleanor Mueller covering all of it for us. Thank you for coming on.
Thanks for having me.
Still ahead this morning, we're going to have the latest on the recovery efforts in Texas after that deadly flooding, as state lawmakers are set to meet today for a special session on that disaster and much, much more. Wait Too Early is coming right back with that.